let's talk about Unfinished Tales by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is, if you like, the fourth book of the trilogy or something. When we think about the big Tolkien books, you think about The Hobbit, you think about Lord of the Rings, you think about the Silmarillion, published posthumously, edited by his son Christopher Tolkien. And that's the kind of the main narratives and the complete narratives, I guess, as well as far as it goes. The Silmarillion is complicated, but yeah, those are complete narratives giving us the big tale of the First Age, some key stuff in the Second Age of Middle-earth, and then the great tales of the Third Age to do with the Rings of Power. Now, this is an oddity. I mean, it says at the very front in this kind of frontispiece, I guess, that this is really for people who enjoy the appendices of the Lord of the Rings. It's extra tales, bits and pieces, illuminating fragments, partial stories that weren't finished. And this was an early selection. You know, there's a ton of stuff. For instance, if you want to look at the evolution of the writing of Middle-earth, you look at the history of Middle-earth, and that includes the two very short fragmentary novels which Tolkien wrote in the 50s and didn't get very far in either. And which are both very interesting, by the way. I've made videos about those. Unfinished Tales, you also have, by the way, loads of stuff that wasn't even published by Christopher Tolkien. You get stuff that comes out in the fanzines, basically, that's authorised. But, you know, here's this longer version of this fragment that there was a quote from in the History of Middle-earth that you picked up on, you know. This is really the core selection of big topics, big treatments of topics, longer versions of stories, unique versions of stories, which haven't been covered in the big three, or haven't been fully covered. So I'll very quickly list them, because it probably is worth just saying this is what's in here, because, and then because there's going to require some commentary, because this is essentially like a meta short story collection. It's all these different stories and materials, and not all of it is strictly narrative fiction. Some of it is fictional history instead, for instance, or in some cases there's etymological notes being put in there that are illuminating. Lots of odd stuff. So you've got Of Tuor and His Coming to Gondolin, you've got the Nana Hin Hurin, you've got the description of the island of Númenor, you've got Aldarion and Erendis the Mariner's Wife, the line of Elros, kings of Númenor, the history of Galadriel and Celeborn and of Amroth, king of Lorien, the disaster of the Gladden Fields, Cirion and Eorl and the friendship of Gondor and Rohan, the quest of Erebor, the hunt for the ring, the battle of the fords of Isen, the Druidine, the Istari and the Palantiri. So this is sorted by First Age, Second Age, Third Age, and then it's got three essays at the end, I think often considered the really juiciest ones, about stuff that transcends a single age. One is about a group of people, the Druidine, two are about groups of people, the Istari, the wizards, and the third is about items, the Palantiri. So you can see that a lot of that is narrative of a form, though some of it really takes the form of fictional history rather than kind of its story. You know, the tone and the way it's put together. Some of them are not a continuous narrative. They are multiple fragments on the same topic being combined, often based on one long version, or various versions that Tolkien have worked over of a particular story, but they're mostly not settled texts. The key thing is virtually all of them are actually unfinished. I think one or two might actually be finished technically, but virtually all of them are unfinished, in the sense that there's a gap. Even in the longest one, the Nana Hin Hurin, there is a big chunk missing of this long version that he was writing, and you instead get pointed towards the Silmarillion, and there's an appendix here summing up some of the details and some of the narratival things that were going on. What would I say? I'm actually going to start out with, call it the recommendation section, then give a bit more on stuff. Would I say this is for a Middle-earth reader who kind of struggled with lots of the Lord of the Rings? It's very long and didn't like the description, and who's this Tom Bombadil guy? No, you shouldn't read it. What about someone who likes those two and indeed likes the Silmarillion, but is a bit worried, like, okay, the appendices have these cool narratives in it. Read Aragorn and Arwen. You know, we go in grief but not despair. Go beyond the circles of the world where there is more than memory. Really wonderful stuff in there. But, you know, there's a lot of just facts and how is this to be recommended to them. There is a lot of stuff here which will appeal to someone who likes the stories of The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion. Even if they're not sure about all the kind of big world building. There's also going to be stuff here that person is just not going to care about very much. And I'll comment on that a bit more. But, I'd say that person might want to look into this. But I wouldn't be like, yes, this is a must-buy. And the third person who's like, oh, wow, I love this world. I really want to find out more. I really like Tolkien as a writer and a thinker. I think this is, really the fourth purchase. Maybe something like Tales from the Perilous Realm will be the fourth purchase. But this is Middle-earth, whereas that's mostly not. The current version does have the Bombadil poems in it, though. So, I would say definitely for that person. The two, I think that the strongest stuff here, much of it comes early on. There's one bit later, one story later, I think is really very strong. And there's lots of interesting stuff. Basically, there's a couple of tiers. One is all the narrative, all the stuff that is presented as narrative, and tonally is presented as narrative, more or less, is very strong. Tolkien could write. It's an odd thing. This is the thing I run into when I kind of reading people saying, obviously if someone just doesn't like The Lord of the Rings, I can hardly dispute their taste, but they're like, oh, it's badly written, or it's written in such an old-fashioned and lame way, and all these criticisms more or less about writing. And you're like, no, one thing I'm afraid Tolkien could do is write narrative. One of the most supreme writers we have. He is not a world builder who then forced this stuff into text because he's just got to get out his weird world somehow. He wrote these books functionally by accident, and the narratives he wrote, they were never published, and he never tried to publish just because he wanted to. He was a tremendously gifted stylist. And so the narrative, so of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin, the Nanahin Hurin, Aldarion and Erendis, the Mariner's Wife, and to some degree Cirion and Eorl and the Friendship of Gondor and Rohan, and the Quest of Erebor, which are the most like fictional narrative. By that I mean like, oh, here's a story, let me tell you a story. Those are all exceptionally strong, without exception. There's sections in some of the others that are also sort of fictional narrative, but those are highly enjoyable in terms of hearing from my buddy read group on Discord about, because we've just finished reading this, their favourites. They were basically always tending towards these narratival sections. There's another category of things which is more like fictional history, or fiction, that sort of thing. It's fictional non-fiction. A description of the island of Númenor, line of Elros, kings of Númenor. In most of the history of Galadriel and Celeborn, the disaster of the Gladden Fields and its appendix, the riveting Númenorian linear measures. The hunt for the ring is kind of a mixture, is a hybrid. I should have mentioned that perhaps. And the Battle of the Fords of Isen, the Druidine, the Astari, and the Palantiri. These are all in narrative history, like fictional history, mode. And this thing, the more you read Tolkien's background stuff, the more you run into this, and this is what you're used to. And this stuff's fascinating. If you like the world building, if you like if like Tolkien, you kind of in a sense you believe in Middle-earth as a sub-creation, as this other thing, and you want to find out more, then he's a very clear and engaging writer. There's no problem there, but it's just not as exciting. And sometimes you've got topics which are going to excite some people more than others. Even amongst the hardcore, some people are going to be much more into the Astari than the Battle of the Fords of Isen. And the reverse, though. The Battle of the Fords of Isen I actually really enjoyed, for instance, but then I am a military history reader, so I'm biased towards a style which tries to draw out a coherent description of the campaign, which we hear a little about in The Lord of the Rings because of the issue of Theodred dying in the first Battle of the Fords of Isen. So, that's something what I really liked that, but some people are going to be like, okay, I just don't care. But, oh man, the Astari, I always wanted to know about the wizards. What do I think about those? So, yes, in that sense, yeah. There's two categories, and I think, generally speaking, the narrative storytelling is the stronger section, and the fictional history stuff is much more niche. Of those, of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin is not the whole story of Tuor, Gondolin, and the flight from Gondolin, but of his origins and his going to Gondolin. And I certainly, one thing is that I'd certainly read the Silmarillion before reading this. The Nanhinhurin is a bit more independent. There is certainly a way in which I think the two big first age narratives here benefit from having read the Quenta, Silmarillion, and I think that's something which seems like an obvious part of the setup of the Lays of Beleriand and the Quenta go together. And Tolkien wrote all kinds of versions of the big lays. The third big lay is so the Gondolinde, is that it? Is one. So Gondolin Tuor is one. The Nanhinhurin is another, and the Lay of Luthien of Beren and Luthien is the third. The three great lays, and they these big definitional stories, and it's interesting. Two of them are about human elf romances, and the third is his great Kalevala tragedy of Middle Earth, which is it is something he obviously keenly felt, and is this almost surreally funny rebuke of Michael Moorcock in a way. Not that you can blame Moorcock for not having read this thing that wasn't published, but you know if you know. But the point is that, yeah, you're going to come into these, and so for instance, of Turin who's coming to Gondolin, and indeed the Nanhinhurin, these heroes Tuor and Turin, their fathers are brothers, so they're actually, and indeed in Turin who's coming to Gondolin, there is a point about where Tuor sees, while he's going with these elves, he sees his cousin. He doesn't know it's his cousin, but he sees the Black Blade of Nargothrond, Turin Turambar, going off wherever he's going at whatever point in the story that is. So they've got this background, and you'll know, if you read the Quenta, then you know that Huor dies with every stroke of his axe as he fells the Orc elite, Aule and Toluva. Day will come again, and you then know also Hurin, his brother, is captured, alas, and is taken and cursed by Morgoth. And though that's covered here, it obviously, you've got this all in this bigger framework, and so I think you'll benefit from that. I think that you could read a hypothetical completed version of this Nanhinhurin on its own. You could give it to someone, and I think lots of people would enjoy it. I really liked, of the two, the Nanhinhurin is over 100 pages, excluding the nearly 20-page appendix, which is explaining the missing section and some of the textual history. Because one section, basically, in this novel, functionally, short novel, he didn't write, he didn't finish. So we have the Quenta version, and we have other versions, and then we have this version. And you can get all the texts composited in the Children of Húrin book. Nanhinhurin is really good. It is obviously something which really compelled Tolkien. He wrote it in many versions. It's very detailed. It's very detailed in the Quenta Silmarillion 2, in the 1950s version of that, which is the basis, really, of the modern Silmarillion book. And so, yeah, there's a lot of detail. Just as an addition to the Silmarillion, it's a fascinating, brilliant narrative. You're like, oh, wow, there's all these characters. This is great. I'm really glad to learn about them. It's very atmospheric. So I really like that. Of Turin Who's Coming to Gondolin, I think, though it is shorter and though it's not the kind of whole arc of Tuor, I think it's just excellent. It's one of my very favourite pieces of Tolkien's writing now. There's a great deal of nature observation. There's some compelling character stuff. There's just some great moments, some great visuals. Tolkien has a very good visual dramatic mind, and you'll see that in The Lord of the Rings. At various points, read the charge of the Rohirrim at the Pelennor Fields, or Aragorn's confrontation of Sauron via the Palantir, things like that. These great epic presentations. In the Second Age, the real standout by far, and maybe the best thing in the book, is Aldarion and Erendis, the Mariner's Wife. Here we've had, this is the third big narrative section. You've got Turin is coming to Gondolin. It's epic fantasy. It's this guy who's, going on a quest, and he comes to a secret city, and he falls in love with an elf maiden, and, then there's other things that happen after that in the Silmarillion. But, he's part of this great story, which is, in fact, going to be where the hope that saves the good, lawful, mortal people from the evil archangel, Melkor Morgoth, Satan, basically. So this is this great epic fantasy story. The Nanhinhurin is a great tragedy. Aldarion and Erendis is a domestic tragedy, I guess, domestic story, about a guy who loves sailing. He's a prince who loves sailing, and his wife doesn't really, but they really love each other, and Aldarion's always avoided marriage, but eventually falls in love with Erendis, and you see their relationship develop. You have romance. You also have the kind of tensions in their marriage at different points over the fact that They just have massively different priorities, and it's very keenly observed, and it's quite gentle. And it's a relatively long section. It's a 50-page section, and I guess a finished version of it might still have come to under 100 of these, fairly dense text pages. But yeah, it is really unique. It's like nothing else. And the point is that with Tuor and Turin, they're in the Silmarillion, so you already have versions of those stories. You also know that Tolkien, he writes other stories that have similar notes. In the Silmarillion in particular, you have other big epic fantasy tales. The voyage of Eärendil and everything leading up to that. And then you have great tragedies, the stuff to do with the sons of Feanor and Maethros particularly, but also the kind of various disasters that strike the elves and men in the West in the First Age. It's there's a lot of this sense of tragedy. So you have both of those, but you don't have a fundamentally domestic tragedy, or domestic drama is probably a better term for it. And Aldarion and Erendis is really good, and it does fit into this other important stuff that happens in Númenórean history. Here's an interesting thing. I haven't watched The Rings of Power, so I don't comment on the show itself, but when you hear people being like, oh, I didn't like this, or I wish they'd done this, or this is the kind of plot you could really have gone for. You're like, you could have a TV series about this. I know there's issues about access, so I'm not talking about, maybe they can't have this material itself, but you can see there's just other stuff, other stories you can develop when you realise, Tolkien just thought, yeah, why don't you just write about a husband and wife who really love each other but don't get on? That's interesting. You also get later on in a note, you get the what turns out to be the background of Queen Baruthu and her cats. If you know, not so much a husband and wife who love each other but don't get on, but something very different. History of Galadriel and Celeborn and of Amroth, King of Lorien, is loads of different patchwork narratives about the ways in which, basically it's about how Galadriel and Celeborn meet and how they end up in the centre, as it were, of Middle-earth and getting to Lorien and becoming king and queen there, or prince and princess or whatever, who knows, king and queen, lord and lady of Lorien, I guess. And some of this contradicts what we do have in the final revised versions of Lord of the Rings, but includes later stuff like where I count this not as a spoiler given it's one of many texts. Oh, maybe Celeborn was also born in Valinor and went into, almost uniquely went into exile despite not being Noldor, which in itself can be a cool story. But there is a thing here that I think this is more. It is more like there's also like, is Amroth, king of Lorien, their son, and when he dies in the Last Alliance, they take over, or is he son of a Sylvan lord or of whoever else? And also this links into this stuff to do with various versions of the legends around Nimrodel and Dol Amroth and how that originates. And so this is interesting, and there are some nice bits of little narrative in there. But it's a lot more like History of Middle-earth. It's textual history, conflicting versions, many conflicting versions, and showing things in terms of the creative mind of Tolkien which are interesting, but which are not strictly the kind of expansion of the world. A big thing for Tolkien, you realise, is, particularly late on, there are a few things in the 60s, and some of them he recovers from, but he develops anxieties about parts of the world, like, was the world ever really flat? Because people seem to think, surely that breaks the principles of subcreation if people think, the world, the Middle Earth was flat and then it became round. And similarly, Galadriel needing her behaviour to be whitewashed, or maybe Amroth needs to fit into Galadriel's story, or maybe everything to do with the Region has to fit into Galadriel's story, or maybe Celeborn, they need to have an earlier romance that is part of the reason for the exile, hence the whitewashing, rather than Galadriel goes to Middle-earth and then meets this prince of Doriath. Like all these things, and and that's kind of interesting textually, but it's less convincing as a narrative. Disaster of the Glenfields and Battle of the Fords of Isen. Disaster of the Glenfields is very short, it's 8 pages. Fords of Isen is 11, it's slightly longer. I enjoyed both of them. Battle of the Fords of Isen is a good military narrative. Disaster of the Glenfields is really interesting as well in terms of both of them trying to talk about how warfare might be undertaken. Disaster of the Glenfields does have some odd fun things, like all the Númenóreans are over 8 feet tall, you hear about there, which does relate to, for instance, their march step and how far they'll march before resting, and to do with their tactics. And it's interesting in a very niche way. Those are going to be some of the least valuable things to lots of people. I enjoyed them. Cirion and Eorl and the Friendship of Gondor and Rohan is four texts, some of which partly overlap, which aren't in full agreement, but which are largely in agreement, which is an attempt to narrativize a variety of things around the Northmen, including, so there are some remaining Northmen, the men of Dale, and and I think the forest, the guys from the forest are still that Northmen, and the Rohirrim, because the Rohirrim are from the Vales of Anduin originally, and they eventually, for various reasons, due to the stuff to do with invasions from the east and friendship with Gondor, travel south. And Kirinne, and this means that Rohan take over most of the northern portion, old portion of Gondor, up to the Gap of Rohan. Rohan comes from east. They are, the Easterners, essentially, because that's where they come from originally. And you've got this really fun. You've got some really interesting things, like there's lots of nice little world building things, like ancient proto Rohan leaders having Gothic names, and the Wain Riders of the East having multiple confederations and settling in different places and clashing with other Eastern nations, Khand particularly. This kind of interesting stuff in terms of thinking, what are the historical inspirations, etc. It has a couple of very good moments. There's some interesting stuff about Middle-earth religion that is also quite powerfully presented. But again, though I think this is probably a wider interest and has more stuff that's going to appeal, it's maybe more limited. The Hunt for the Ring, we'll quickly say, is a couple of different versions of how the Black Riders hunt, try to come up to the Shire and get into the action of the Lord of the Rings, and that, I think that's actually fairly slight as a premise, but there's some fun ideas, like Tolkien wondering whether or not there are still hobbits, Stoors, so particularly Gollum's people. Many of whom go to the Shire, but some of whom obviously may stay behind. But are they still in the Vales of Anduin? And are they then routed out by the Black Riders? And I think he then also thinks maybe that didn't happen. It's a curiosity. It is narrative. It has a slightly more narrative rather than historic style. But it's, again, fairly slight. The Quest of Erebor is only 7 pages, but though it then has some extracts from the earlier version which help illuminate what might have happened in the kind of version included here. But it's basically Gandalf's account of The Hobbit, rather than Bilbo's account. And it's really good, and it's, though it's relatively short, as I say, though, you can add in the other stuff, and though it's not therefore a fully cohesive narrative, it has both an interesting tone, the realisation of what's really going on behind the scenes, Gandalf's attempts to engage with Thorin, Gandalf doing other stuff, generally, and also the fact that you have a narrator there, so you're like, in the same way that you know there are limitations to the narrative of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings based on the actual knowledge of, of Bilbo and Frodo and Sam. You've got Gandalf having his own interests here, things, and even the fact he refuses to illuminate some things, refuses to explain and leaves. And you're like, it's not an unreliable narrator, but it is a limited narrative viewpoint, and that's a sign that Tolkien is willing to do that elsewhere as well. And we should know that just by reading his books. But yeah, it's fun. It also emphasises the dwarfiness of the Hobbit. It is true in Tolkien's terms. The book of his 3 big books, if you count the Silmarillion, that is about dwarves, is The Hobbit. You might think, surely it's about the Hobbit. It's kind of about the Hobbit, but really as a exploration of a people, even if it has a slightly kind of silly tone at points, it's about dwarves. That's the kind of world building topic, and we get that, and that's strong. And I really enjoyed The Quest of Erebor. Part 4, the general essays, which are both, I think both have like a significant text they're using, and then they also quote lots of other things, more or less every major fragment on these topics. The Druidine, who are the Woodwosies of the Druidan forest, the Astari and the Palantiri. And the Druidine though they are different hobbits, they are bigger, they are squatter. They're like the hobbits in that they seem to be a human species, and we hear the hobbits are humans in Tolkien's notes. It's interesting because, of course, elves and humans are also biologically identical but spiritually distinct. There's a weird thing going on there. But the hobbits are closer to humans in that sense, and so are the Druidine. And the big things here is that we find out a few things, you know, Tolkien trying to work out a few things that certainly one, Druidine went to the west, went into Beleriand in the First Age with the Haladin, the people of Haleth, who we hear more about here, but also that they lived with them. And there's a little really fun narrative called The Faithful Stone, and a couple other bits about them as well. But also there's remnants probably in the western White Mountains or on the peninsula of Andrast. They might be associated with some of the other kind of fairly discreet peoples up in, I think, is it the Rivermouth fishermen of Enidwaith. These odd people, I've spoken about them in a video on this channel actually, but you know, because there's these human tribes or confederations who are basically never in the narrative and don't deal with anyone at all along this kind of centre of northwest Middle Earth, and the Druidine probably are associated with some of them. So yeah, the Druidine I really enjoyed. The Astari and the Palantiri. The Astari is, again, a ragbag of everything, and there's a great world-building thing that I came away with, which was to do with the fact that one of the only two volunteers for going to Middle-earth is one of the Blue Wizards, and the Blue Wizards are both Maiar angels of the host of the Valar archangel Orome, who's like the god of the hunt basically, and the god of exploration, and that was interesting. The Palantiri, again, because one thing is you almost want Christopher Tolkien with some of these to be like, I'm going to write down all the information I, Christopher Tolkien, know, and I'll give references, and he does that sometimes in some places. But one thing with presenting his father's text is that you sometimes get this thing like the seventh Palantir. So there's 7 of these magic stones that are given to Elendil basically, and the 7th he places at Emimberiad in the Tower Hills, and it only faces west. It can't contact the other stones, and it only faces west. And that's not mentioned in the fragment that we have here, but it is mentioned in the Lord of the Rings appendices, and so Christopher Tolkien then in the notes to this is then, you get the point I'm making, is that these are things where basically we're getting these as, this is the best you'll get on this from my father. He doesn't want to assume authority over it, and he regrets having done that a bit with the Silmarillion, having sometimes put stuff together in a particular way to make it make sense. And so yeah, I think in section 4, the Druidine is the best section because it has, again, a strong bit of narrative, and it's also one that seems kind of, in a funny way, adds the most to our understanding of lots of parts of the world, even if in a different way, the Palantiri particularly in terms of understanding how some things pan out in the narrative, and how the Palantir affects Saruman and Denethor. That seems really valuable as illumination in Lord of the Rings, but is in a sense almost something you can often more or less draw from the text of the Lord of the Rings. So yeah, I think there's some really strong stuff. Basically, it is a very good collection. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. I guess it doesn't compete with any of the main 3 books, but particularly with the ones which I think the most supreme accomplishments of their type, which is, I think, the Lord of the Rings, and to a significant degree the Quenta Silmarillion. The Hobbit is also, you know, pretty perfect. In that sense, it's both not quite quality-wise the same, though it is very high, and it's not the same kind of thing. I think my recommendation is already made, but I think there is just a case for saying, look, Aldarion and Erendis is, in a sense, it's unique in the way that The New Shadow is unique. It's this kind of weird kind of thriller thing he writes, except there's much more of Aldarion and Erendis. There's 50 pages rather than 10. I think there's just some of his best writing and stuff like of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin, and I think there's just some really great bits and pieces like the Quest of Erebor, the Faithful Stone, and so yes, I would in that sense recommend this. If you've read Unfinished Tales, I'd love to hear what your thoughts were and what you enjoyed most from it. So tell me in the comments, and I will see you next time.